Hi everyone! Welcome back to the Anna-losophy Podcast. Today we're returning to a philosopher who is one of my absolute favorites, and that is Immanuel Kant. Now I know that after the last episode, some of you are probably thinking, wait, I thought we were already done with Kant. There's more? Yep, there is a lot more. Because in our last episode on Kant, we spent most of our time talking about the morality aspect of things. We looked at truth-telling, consequences, duty, and why Kant believed that people should never be treated merely as tools for someone else's hopes. And those ideas are very important. But after finishing that episode, I realized that there was a whole side of Kant that we hadn't even touched, and that's why I'm doing this episode on Kant today. In fact, some historians would argue that this side of his philosophy is even more important than his ethics. So today, I want to focus on 3 questions that completely transform philosophy. First, are we seeing reality itself or only our version of reality? Second, what are the limits of human knowledge? And third, why do humans keep asking questions that they may never be able to answer? My personal favorite. And those questions might sound a little bit abstract at first, but they're really connected to almost everything we do, like religion, politics, education, science, and even everyday decision-making all depend on assumptions about reality. So let's start with the first one. Are we seeing reality itself or only our version of reality? And at first glance, this sounds like a question that has an easy answer, because most of us would probably say that, of course, we're seeing reality. Yeah, I can look around my room right now and see walls, furniture, books, and other objects, and it feels pretty obvious that these things exist exactly as I perceive them. But Kant wanted people to slow down and think about what is actually happening when they experience the world. And he pointed out that everything we know comes through our senses and is processed by our minds. We never encounter reality completely directly. Every sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, all of it is filtered through our own perception before we even become aware of it. And one example that really helped me understand this idea involves color. We tend to think of colors as properties that objects naturally possess. We say that apples are red, grass is green, the sky is blue. But when you look at how color works scientifically, things become a lot more complicated. Objects don't actually contain redness or blueness. Instead, they reflect certain wavelengths of light, which our brains often interpret as colors. The experience of red exists because of the interaction between the physical world and the human mind. Now, if humans have evolved differently, it's possible that we would experience colors in a completely different way that we don't know of now. And this led Kant to one of his most famous distinctions. He argued that there is a difference between the world as it appears to us and the world as it exists independently of us. As in, the world as we experience it is sometimes called the phenomenal world. This is the world of everyday life, the world of science, observation, and experience. Then there is what Kant calls the nominal world, which refers to reality as it exists apart from human perception. The difficult part is that Kant believed we can never fully access this nominal world. We can study appearances and experiences and study the way reality presents itself to human beings. But what we can't do is step outside our own minds and compare our perceptions to reality in its purest form. And when I first learned this, it was kind of frustrating and also kind of confusing, because it almost felt like Kant was placing a really, really giant wall or barrier between us and reality. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in fact, he wasn't trying to make knowledge completely impossible for us. Instead, he was trying to explain how knowledge really worked. So instead of pretending that human beings have some magical access to reality, he was reminding us that, hey, every experience is affected by the fact that we are human, and we see the world through human eyes, process it through human brains, and understand it through human concepts. So it really means that knowledge has a perspective. It doesn't make knowledge completely worthless, because this is just the reality of things. And this brings us to the second question. What are the limits of human knowledge? One thing that fascinates me about Kant is that he lived during the Enlightenment. Enlightenment was a period where people were becoming increasingly confident in the power of reason. Scientific discoveries were happening. Philosophers were developing new theories about government, economics, and human nature. There was a growing sense that human beings could solve almost any problem if they applied enough intelligence and enough effort. Kant admired reason a lot, but he also believed that people were becoming overconfident about what reason could accomplish. Now, Kant argued that there are certain questions that human beings naturally ask but can never fully answer. Think about some of the biggest questions imaginable. Can you think of some? I guess some questions are, did the universe have a beginning? Is there a God? Do human beings truly have free will? And does the soul survive death? And I noticed that these questions have been debated for thousands of years, and despite all of our advances of science and philosophy, there is still no universal agreement. And that's what makes Kant really interesting here. It's that he doesn't simply dismiss these questions, and he doesn't say that these are meaningless or stupid. Instead, he argues that the human mind is naturally drawn towards them. We want answers because we're creatures that are very curious. We want to understand everything, like where we came from, why we're here, and what ultimately is behind reality itself. The problem is that these questions often push us beyond what we can directly observe or verify. A great example involves the origin of the universe. Suppose someone asks whether the universe had a beginning. If you say yes, another question immediately appears, like what happened before the beginning? But if you say the universe never began and has always existed, a different problem emerges. How could an infinite amount of time have already passed? And according to Kant, reason can produce powerful arguments on both sides of the debate. The reason is that we kind of become tangled in all of these contradictions. But the most relatable part of Kant's philosophy is this. Like, have you ever stayed up late at night thinking about existence and suddenly found yourself really overwhelmed? Because one minute you're thinking about school or work, and the next minute you're wondering, why do we exist? Or wait, does anything exist at all? And the more deeper you go, the stranger the questions become. Kant realized this tendency and habit and believed that it was built into our nature. Our minds constantly search for ultimate explanations, even when those explanations might remain out of reach. And what's especially important is that Kant didn't view these limits as failures, although they are limits. In fact, he thought recognizing the limits of knowledge was a sign of maturity, in terms of intellectually speaking. Today, we're often surrounded by people who are absolutely certain about everything, because we love confidence on social media. Public debates also reward confidence. People also admit as though admitting that you're not confident or you're uncertain about something means that you're weak. Kant would disagree. He believed that understanding what we don't know is just as important as understanding what we do know. And this leads naturally into the final question. Why do human beings keep asking questions that may never be able to answer? Out of everything we've discussed today, this is probably my favorite part of Kant's philosophy. Now, even though he believed there were limits to knowledge, he never suggested that people should stop asking difficult questions. Quite the opposite, actually. He thought our desire to ask these questions revealed something very important about what it means to be human, quite monumental. Think about how often people search for meaning. Every culture throughout history has built philosophies, myths, stories, and religions that attempt to explain existence. Human beings seem incapable of simply accepting the world without asking why. Why are we here? Why does the universe exist? What happens after our death? Is there an afterlife? What is the purpose of life? And these questions appear over and over and over again across different civilizations and different historical periods. And Kant believed that reason naturally pushes us toward these questions. The human mind wants explanations, and we want some kind of closure. And it wants to connect individual facts into a larger picture. If a child repeatedly asks, why? Personal experience, every answer generates another question. Eventually, the chain of explanation stretches towards questions that may never have final answers. Yet we keep asking them anyway. Even as someone who is confused about Kant at first, I find this idea very comforting. In a way, Kant is saying that the search itself is value. Even if we never solve every mystery, the process of questioning and investigating and thinking about reality is quite worthwhile. Some of humanity's greatest achievements came from people refusing to stop asking questions. But before we wrap up, I want to recommend a few readings for anyone interested in exploring Kant further. If you're completely new to him like I was, I would actually start with his essay, What is Enlightenment? It helped me a lot, and it's relatively short, surprisingly readable, and introduces one of his most famous ideas, and the English translation is Dare to Know. This essay encourages people to think for themselves and use their own reason rather than following authority blindly. For the second one, I would recommend Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and this is where many of Kant's ethical ideas appear in their most famous form. It's definitely more challenging than the essay, but it's much more approachable than some of his larger works. And finally, if you're feeling ambitious, you can try selections from Critique of Pure Reason. I'm in the middle of reading this now, and this is one of the most difficult books I've ever read. Maybe one of the most difficult books in philosophy. And a lot of professional philosophers spend quite a long time studying it, but reading even a few chapters does help you. It gives you a sense of how ambitious Kant's project really was and why his influence became so enormous. And by the time Kant died in 1804, he had completely transformed philosophy. Generations of thinkers spent their careers responding to his ideas, whether they agreed with him or disagreed with him. Even today, many debates about science, knowledge, morality, and human nature still trace back to questions that Kant raised over 200 years ago. That's an incredible legacy for someone who spent most of his life just quietly reading, writing, and teaching in a single city. So thank you guys so much for joining me for today's episode. We looked at whether we're seeing reality itself or only our experience of it, explored the limits of our knowledge, and discussed why human beings continue searching for answers to questions that may never be fully resolved. Whether you end up agreeing with him or not, I think there is something pretty inspiring and special about the seriousness with which he approached these problems. And he reminds us that some of the most important questions are also the most difficult ones ever. So until next time, please keep reading, please keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye!